295, yeah. No, I always get this wrong. Hi, good evening, and thank you for joining us on day 295 at Good Governance GGY. We are joined today by our usual gang. We have Damaris, Leisha, Chris, Ani, Angeline, and I'm Chaminda. And we have Manik there as well. Hi. And we have three very special guests. We are joined by three executive committee members of the People's Struggle Alliance, a left-wing political coalition in Sri Lanka that emerged in response to the country's ongoing social, economic, and political crisis. I think born of the Aragalaya, right? I think that's how we've been talking about you. The platform focuses on achieving progressive political power and implementing policies that promote social justice, economic equity, and democratic governance. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. So rather than me giving you a lengthy introduction, we have Kalpa Rajapaksa, who is a lecturer, I believe lecturing in economics.
Yes.
And then we have Swastika, who's been here before, attorney at law, your second visit to GGY. Thank you for coming. And then we have Danusha Patirana, an economist from the Alliance who are here. So rather than me, like I said, introducing, can we get an introduction about, about your sort of qualifications for being in the EC of the party, your motivations, and what kind of led you to this action of creating this coalition? Ladies first.
Oh, okay. Okay. I think one of my main motivations, I'll start there, for joining this coalition is in these elections, whether it be presidential or parliamentary, I was actually feeling very demotivated to cast my vote or even participate in the election, which should not be the case, because in a democratic state, a vote is very important. So when this idea came about that perhaps left parties together with people, activists and leaders who emerged from the Aragalaya should get together and form an alliance, I also immediately wanted to join that alliance, because that was a space which I felt could push for policies and ideas which I believed in. And I did not want to do that as an individual. So there is a party called the Socialist People's Forum, which is a small party, it's not a mass party, which is essentially a group of intellectuals, trade union leaders, and left activists. So I joined that party because many of their principles and policies I agreed with, and then that party joined this alliance, the People's Struggle Alliance. So the People's Struggle Alliance essentially consists of three left parties: the Frontline Socialist Party, the Socialist People's Forum, and the New Democratic Marxist-Leninist Party. Yeah. And a group of activists and professionals and leaders who emerged from the Aragalaya, but who have left-leaning or left ideology. So we came together and we established this People's Struggle Alliance. And as you mentioned in your introduction, we are focusing on social and economic transformation. One of the issues in the Aragalaya was, one of the strengths of the Aragalaya was there was no political leadership as such. But that was also the weakness of the Aragalaya. So beyond Gota leaving his office,
centralized structure. There was no very loose sort of
there was no centralized ideology where everyone came together. So I think that centralized, not even centralized, that coherence in ideas and thought is important for us to take a political movement forward, or a political idea of the state forward. Right. So I think that is how this People's Struggle Alliance formed, and that's how I joined in. And because we were, all three of us, few of the initial members who joined in, we all came together as the executive committee. And then we are taking it forward.
How many in the executive committee altogether?
Around 20.
And so one member from each party has a place in the EC, or how does that work? What's your sort of...
Each party nominated members, and executive committees we decided when we came together, the initial number of people who came together to form this alliance. Okay. But we kept it open in terms of new people who want to join that central committee, the decision-making committee and so on. The reason why we kept it open is because we recognized the fact that this was only an initial gathering of these three parties and Aragalaya activists. So we wanted to keep that open. Anyone who agrees with left principles and ideas, we wanted to keep it open to bring them also into this coalition. Right. So it's the executive committee formed with the initial group of people, but still, if more people are to join, Then with the initial, of course, with the agreement of the initial existing membership, we want to expand this as well.
Right. So I have questions.
Yes.
But we'll come to that after we hear from the two gentlemen on an introduction about yourselves. Who wants to go? Go on.
Yeah. So I think the good portion of my story is Representative Swastika presented. But I mean, three things basically. Why do we do this? Why do we actually join the alliance? Three things I should mention.
Before that,
yeah.
just give your credentials a little bit so that people know
currently
who you are.
I'm working as a lecturer at University of Peradeniya.
Right.
I'm attached to the Department of Economics and Statistics. I'm teaching political economy. That's why I'm an expert.
Right.
I got my PhD in political economy, which is actually nourished in the Marxian tradition in academia. So that's my story in brief. I have research interest in various areas like agrarian question of Sri Lanka, class conflict, class issues in Sri Lanka. Those are my research areas. So three things I want to mention. Why did I join this alliance, and why do I actually involve in this kind of politics? The very first thing is actually the energy that we got from Aragalaya 2022. We were looking for a place to actually place that in a better political atmosphere with better political structure. So that's the very first reason. The second one is actually we want to see that the neoliberal history is ending in Sri Lanka. There shouldn't be any future for neoliberal policies in Sri Lanka. So that's the second reason. Third one is we want to build socialism in Sri Lanka. All the leftist parties that indicated them as the flag bearers of socialism has given it up. Yeah. Fundamentals have given up their fundamentals, their values, even their party organizations. So one thing that we want to put forward is the idea of socialism, values of socialism. So those are the three things that I want to see that this alliance is actually.
Yeah, you're alluding maybe to the NDP there, right? Like in terms of
absolutely
the JVP NPP. So you're a left of where they are in terms of ideology.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay. So we'll get to the whole Marxism, socialism question in a bit.
Sure.
After we hear from Dhanusha.
Yeah. So I work as a researcher for Institute of Political Economy and also the Law and Society Trust in economics. So and also work as a visiting lecturer at the Open University in development studies in sociology and so on. That is my, so to speak, the background. So so I joined the alliance, People's Struggle Alliance, for
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, look, there are like certain interests that are not being represented by all the mainstream parties that are now contesting. Like Kalpa and Swastika before me expanded on them very clearly. So, so I think there is a need to represent these interests, which actually, or rather say the issues which are getting blocked by the political interests which are the center of these particular parties, and those are class alliances that shape them. I mean, the political parties, their interests are shaped by the class alliances that from which they are based on. So due to this, certain issues which are of grave nature are not being addressed adequately,
right?
Both politically, ideologically, and I guess, so to say, intellectually. So now these things, not for just for the academic sake, but there should be a political motive also behind. I mean, addressing these issues. So I thought the PSA is a brilliant platform for that, and it's a coalition of all progressive people, and I might say it is not also not limited to those who are actually strongly. Now, I myself, of course, I'm leaning towards socialism and communism, but the alliance itself is not limited to that particular strand of politics, and it is open for all forms of progressive politics that can enrich the people's motive at this particular juncture in politics as well.
Right, okay, thank you. So before we get to questions, you shared something about your platform with us, which is your 6E program. Basically, the 6E program says exit IMF, end austerity, eliminate suppressive laws, end exploitation, marginalization, and religionism based on ethnicity, language, religion, and gender, economic and distributional justice, establish people's power and democracy. So these are the key tenets of your political platform, right? Would you like to explain a little bit about?
So perhaps I will touch on the governance part, and I have economists here, so perhaps they will talk on the economic issues. So two issues I think primarily our country has been grappling with since independence. One is the economic structures, and based on the economic structures, we also have been struggling with various social issues. For instance, the ethnic conflict, the ethnic war, the national question, and so on. And whether it be parties on the right or whether it be parties on the left, I'm only speaking about the governance part. Both sides have not been able to take on the national question, take on the ethnic question and deal with it for various reasons. I mean, they have come up with, at various points, they've come up with piecemeal solutions. So, for instance, during Chandrika Bandaranaike's time, she did come up with an acceptable constitution for the minorities, and then you find Ranil Wickremesinghe's party burning the constitution. Yeah. So, at various times, at various points, people did try to come up with solution, but the interest of the elite was never to resolve the ethnic conflict, and that is how we see it. And because of that, towards the end, in May 2009, it ended up with this bloody end to the war. So, apart from, I mean, Kalpa and Dhanusha will talk about the economic structures, but in terms of governance, one of the things which we wanted to centrally tackle was this national question. And what the minorities have been asking is some kind of self-rule, self-governance. The majority community has been asking, saying that they have this phobia of the country being divided and so on. So we've come together on this issue and said, people should, if people want self-governing territories, they should be given self-governing territories. But Sri Lanka is a small country. There are many geopolitical interests at play.
You're talking about the federal system, is it? Like
we do. Federalism? It's not a federal system, and a power sharing system inside a unitary structure has various differences. Right. So we are more moving towards a power sharing concept, but a power sharing concept to the point where territories have certain autonomous powers to be, they can decide and they can govern on their own. And that is what I think is primarily missing in the, for instance, the 13th Amendment. So we have come up with this is of course between the three political parties and the activists on what we have discussed and come up with. So we have come up with this structure. And of course, we need to put this structure to people in the north and the east, people in the south, and so on. And then, of course, there would be changes and modifications. But this is the primary plan which we are putting through in terms of the national question. But one of the things which we are very, very specific on and very concrete on is the fact that we want to resolve the national question so that once and for all, so that our future generations would not be divided on ethnic lines and racial and religious lines and so on. We do not see that happening in any other parties. For instance, we don't see SJB, for instance, or we don't see the UNP or POHOTU for very obvious reasons. Or we don't even see NPP, for instance, really tackling the question of race, which has been plaguing our country for this long. And one of the reasons is war is over, so no one is talking about it, so we don't have to deal with it. But we are taking on the question, despite the fact that there is no war, despite the fact that there is no visible struggle, we are taking on the question of the national question, and we have proposed a solution. So that is on the whole issue of national question. On the other side of governance, many political...
Sorry, can I just... So on that particular point, are you all committing to like the full implementation of the 13th Amendment, like police powers, all of that? Is that what you're committing to, or something completely new?
So I think what we have to look at it from two perspectives. One is, let's say we come to power tomorrow, 13th Amendment is already in the Constitution. Yeah. So we as an alliance don't really understand why parties are going and promising the full implementation of 13th Amendment. When they say we want to give the full implementation of 13th Amendment, essentially what they're saying is, right now the 13th Amendment is not being implemented, which is the Constitution is not being implemented, which is highly problematic. So what we are saying is whatever is in the Constitution will be implemented. The 13th Amendment will be implemented as the 13th Amendment as according to the Constitution, because it is in the Constitution. There is no debate there.
Which is the law of the land.
Which is the law of the land. However, there are certain problems in the 13th Amendment. There are certain ways in which, for instance, the president can hold powers. I mean, for instance, elections have not been called in the province. So there are inherent problems in the 13th Amendment, and that is why we are not relying on the 13th Amendment to resolve the national question. Instead, we have proposed an entirely new solution. But we are also recognizing the fact that this new solution is not going to come overnight. So if we do come to power tomorrow, Constitution is going to be implemented. So which means 13th Amendment will be implemented in full, but we are not saying that because it is given, you should be implementing the Constitution. Ranil Wickremesinghe should not be saying, I will be implementing the 13th, that should not even be a point of debate. So that is the position which our alliance has taken in terms of the 13th Amendment.
Right, so that's on the political side.
That's on the political side.
On the economic side,
yes.
So you're talking about exiting IMF, ending austerity. I think one has led to the other. Would you like to sort of elaborate on what your plans would be if IMF is not the solution? What is the alternative?
Yeah, sure. So I'll try to explain a little bit about the exit IMF. Why do we say exit IMF? What is the political implication of the idea of exit IMF? If you look at when we involved in Aragalaya, maybe you can remember that if you were at Gotagogama Golfes, that we published a small pamphlet which was actually titled as People's Solution for Economic Crisis in Sri Lanka. We were showing an alternative way to solve the economic crisis of Sri Lanka, which was actually not an economic crisis but a financial crisis in the first place.
And a governance crisis,
absolutely.
Right? I mean,
then eventually it was transformed into a deeper economic crisis. Now it is an economic crisis which we have to bear the burden for like next 10 to 15 years. So in that pamphlet, we mentioned three things. If we find a solution for the economic crisis, there are three principles that should not be violated. The very first one was actually the solution should not increase the debt burden of Sri Lanka. But if you look at the IMF program, it has completely increased Sri Lanka's debt burden. Second principle was privatization of state-owned enterprises and resources of the country. It has happened. If you look at the Ranil Wickremesinghe's program, a complete privatization of state-owned enterprises. Maybe the issue is all about increasing the efficiency, restructuring, but what they are doing right now under the IMF solution is basically selling them out. So that has been violated. Third one is actually a solution should not violate sovereignty of the country. That's the third one. If you look at the IMF program and the proposed solutions, completely violated Sri Lanka's sovereignty in two ways. First one is it has violated the right of the people and any government that comes to power to determine the financial policy of the country. Second one, if you look at the economic transformation bill, they are using the sentences that appeared in the IMF recommendations. Specifically three sentences which are actually going to affect the fiscal policy of the country, they are in the same form. So it has been completely violated. The financial policy and the fiscal policy, the people's democracy, people's right to determine them, any government, it can be right wing, left wing, but the right to determine the appropriate economic, fiscal and financial policy, it is no longer there. If the economic transformation bill is actually going to be the law of the country, that's going to happen. So these three principles has been violated. So that's why we are saying that IMF is not a solution.
Okay, so basically when the IMF came in, generally for an economy, like it's your last resort, right? Like essentially when it's like the ICU for economies. So essentially means of last resort. We lost access to international markets. We know the sort of twin deficit crisis that brought us to the eventual crash of our economy. I mean, root causes aside, if we were not now, they also did a governance diagnostic, right? Do you at least agree with that particular document? Because what that talked about tax reform, procurement process reforms, restructuring state-owned enterprises, not necessarily sale. Right? It didn't specify, it didn't say go and sell. It said you've got to do something about these inefficient institutions. And last week we had a program for nearly an hour and a half about SOE restructure, and there's like 500 SOEs, 54 under the Ministry of Finance, and nobody can explain, nobody can even classify some of these SOEs. So I get certain SOEs are necessary for in terms of national interest, right? Like your electricity distribution, it affects everyone. So maybe there's a nuance to that, right? And then addressing corruption, improving governance, boosting economic growth. I mean, these were the basic sort of areas that the diagnostic report identified. Do you disagree with that, or is it the implementation? Because basically IMF is a bank, right? And they don't have enforcement mechanisms. I mean, the implementation is up to the government and really what the IMF does is give you access to international markets, right? Ultimately, because right now we're between a rock and a hard place because there's sovereign bonds are not worth much and so on. So do you agree with the diagnostic that we need to do all of that? Or is it like an outright dismissal of the IMF?
I think it's absolutely correct that we need our own numbers. But what we are doing right now is we are relying on IMF numbers. One of the main things we should do is actually having our own analysis about the debt crisis. But do we have that? I don't think so.
Not an objective one, anyway.
Absolutely not. Absolutely. So I would say the science.
It's like the patient trying to diagnose itself.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. I mean, if I try to answer your question, for example, what happened to the government sector? Why the government sector's income has decreased so much? If you might see a very spontaneous answer in the very recent IMF report. But if you go and read the 1990s analysis of IMF about Sri Lanka, they were the people who say that cut off these taxation, give these tax relaxations for these particular industries. Yeah. So if you look at that, there's a deep contradiction of what IMF said in 1990s and what they're saying right now. So I think the crisis is much more deeper, and definitely we need our own numbers. That's why we are recommending, if not the IMF, one of the solutions, part of the solution could be actually having our own numbers, analyzing basically the way we borrowed from the debtors, from the debtors basically, and also how we utilize the funds. That should be done. Because we deeply believe that if you look at the mountain of debt of Sri Lanka, there are various kinds of debt in the mountain. Illegitimate debt is there, odious debt is there, and also vulture funds are also there. And also, so there should be a proper auditing to come to a conclusion where these are the real numbers that we have to consider when we are repaying. If we are having a mechanism, a plan to repay, these are the numbers we should consider. This has been done properly in one of the countries. Let me mention that, Ecuador. Ecuador has done their own debt analysis because they wanted to get the real numbers and to have a proper plan to pay back. But Sri Lanka, we are still believing the numbers that are given by the IMF. I deeply believe IMF is taking the side of the creditors, not the debted countries. So they present their own argument based on that. And their treatments obviously are based on those numbers.
Just to add one thing, which I think the IMF diagnostic was missing from the start, is that when Mahinda Rajapaksa started borrowing from the international sovereign markets, and that is why in one of my press releases also I said, I don't want to listen to the orthodox economists, because what we should have been warned in 2007, no one was speaking about except the economists who took a different position even back then. Yeah. So when we went to the international sovereign markets, one of the things which economists who were with the government did not warn us about is about the high interest. And when we came to the crisis, now everyone is talking about the sovereign bonds and how we have been unable to pay the sovereign bonds and so on, right? And so one of the things about the IMF's diagnostic, what they call diagnostic, is that they don't really talk about one thing about the international financial architecture and how that is causing not only our country, but there is a UNDP report which says 53 countries are in debt distress. So this is not only Sri Lanka falling. Few weeks ago you saw the tax protests which happened in Kenya, which also... So this is a problem of global south. Sri Lanka also has been caught in it. We have our own problems. We have our own corruption and so on. But one of the things which I have been observing and happening is that our people have been gaslighted to think that if we get everything order on the ground, if we have no corruption, if we select clean politicians, suddenly all our problems will vanish and we won't be in this crisis. And that is not so. Corruption is a huge problem, but that is not the only issue and the only problem which resulted in this financial crisis. So that aspect of the failing of the international global architecture, finance architecture, is not even touched by the IMF. And the second issue is accountability. IMF does not talk about the past financial crimes committed by the Rajapaksas. And today Ranil Wickremesinghe is the president because he's backed by the Rajapaksas. So the IMF is negotiating with a president who is not elected by the people. So IMF is not accountable, as you said, IMF is not accountable to the Sri Lankan people. Ranil Wickremesinghe is not accountable to the Sri Lankan people. So two parties are entering into an agreement and binding all of us for the next several years.
Yeah.
Without both parties not being accountable to the Sri Lankan people.
Right.
So that's a huge, that is, I think, one of the most fundamental, issues in the IMF agreement. And IMF is not just, as you said, it's not an institution. Yeah. Its board consists of majority, for instance, majority of the board members are from countries like the US. So it is not, it does not happen in a vacuum that the IMF has come and given us this loan. Elections are being pushed. No one is speaking about it. It's not, all of this is not happening in a vacuum. Yeah. So I think as people of Sri Lanka, we should be conscious of that. And also I always say this, we should stop blaming ourselves. Yes, things happen. Corruption happened. How many people understand economics is not a simple subject. 50% of our EPF fund is going to disappear, but we find it very hard to explain this to workers that your EPF fund is going to be stolen because it's not an easy concept to explain. So I think at one point we should stop blaming ourselves. We are in this state of crisis. How do we come out of the crisis? But we should not be, like all of us, we should not be guilting the Sri Lankan people because there are things which we can do and there are things which are beyond our control. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Before going to him. If you look at the recent financial crisis, what is the immediate reason for that? The immediate reason for the recent financial crisis, 2022, which erupted in 2022, is the 10 billion USD that got Sri Lankan government by selling ISP in 2017. 10 billion USD under Governor Kumaraswamy.
And the interest payments.
Absolutely. And who was in power? Who was in power? The good governance government was in power. And Ranil Wickremesinghe was actually steering the entire state mechanism, entire everything basically. So I think he should be responsible for this, and he's one of the people who actually created this crisis by unwittingly getting into the global financial markets. They should know. They are deeply aware of that.
Wittingly, unwittingly. I mean, motivations are hard to attribute here, right? And also, there's very little transparency as to where those, the actual bonds and the interest payments and all that. Who benefits from all of that? We actually don't know. Yeah. I think Murtaza explained it to us, right? So there's so much.
Lots of hidden hands there.
Yeah. So I absolutely agree on that particular front. But if you look at, so we have an issue with sort of root cause analysis. I mean, there's plenty of blame to go around, right? But say, like you said, like you take power, we are almost at 100% debt to GDP right now, right? I think 80 billion or something, right? Our debt right now, and it has increased by about $20 billion since the crisis began. Part of that is the IMF loan and so on. So now your second point is ending austerity, right? Now the reason we had an Aragalaya was because our reserves were down to zero. We couldn't import certain essentials, which brought people to the streets. Exiting the IMF, wouldn't that create the same sort of conditions that began an Aragalaya in the first place?
Amisha?
So, well, I think now we had to, although we don't have so much of time, we had to, I think, look at the reasons which led the whole economy to that point where, you know, people were on streets demanding, I mean, the basic essentials were missing. They were not no longer accessible. So whether we would go back in there because we exit the IMF program, I think, I mean, it depends on like what you replace the IMF with. So, and also I think before answering that question, I would also like to highlight what we have signed on to with the IMF, especially what taking on from what Kalpa started on the debt restructuring program and what Swastika said about whether there is any legitimacy to this program, considering the fact that it was Rajapaksa who got chased away, and now the incumbent president is there with the blessings of the Rajapaksas under the Rajapaksa regime. So that the IMF is basically signing an agreement for next, I should say for next 20 years, because the bilateral debt agreement is up for 2043, and with a government that has zero legitimacy, zero legitimacy with the public. So just to give you some basic examples, so it makes it very clear. So now there is this draconian figure which IMF came up saying that if we reach this figure of debt to GDP, this 95% magical figure, if we reach that by say 2032 or 33, we will be fine. They didn't say that, you know, we are off all the trouble, but then said relatively fine. This is the most horrendous distortion of accepted norms in debt stability for especially countries in the third world without a convertible currency like the dollar and so on. Now in 2000 there was a Jubilee movement that came to an end, and with that movement that created a whole heap of ideas about what should be the at least some form of sustainability framework should be drawn up for the third world in terms of debt. So with those insights there came a UN I should say a UN document on a particular framework which clearly said a country like this should be at least having their debt lower than 50% of their GDP, not just the foreign debt, the entire damn debt. And then the revenue out of which you pay interest, the interest should be below 25%, whereas ours is at over 75% right now, which is the highest in the world. Next in line is Ghana, that is in the mid-40s. So you should see how the debt is eating up into the revenue, and also where the tax money is going. It is going to service an interest, and whose interest? Whose interest are we serving through interest? Now it is the domestic bondholders of domestic debt, not just the foreign debt. There is a massive issue with the domestic debt, which I don't know that we have time to go into that.
We didn't restructure domestic debt completely, did we? We touched
we destroyed the EPF.
EPF.
We had destroyed the revenue streams of the EPF and allowed these sharks to make a killing out of the bond market. And that the restructuring process itself was designed in a way that you allowed them to make a killing. Right? So their bond values went through the roof when the interest rates came down. They had no impact of the debt restructuring. There was no reduction on the coupon rates, which meant that your bond values would skyrocket when the interest rates came down gradually. So they bought the bonds, like 75% of the bonds which are issued above 25% coupon rate, which with a yield of close to 30%. All of them were snatched up by the financial sharks in the country. 75% of it. So all that was untouched. So I'm going all over the place. But everything. As
just to make the point, I think the people who created the problem can't be responsible for creating the conditions for the recovery. I think we all agree on that, right? I think we all agree on that.
Benefited, and they are still steering the ship, right? And they are still in very much control. And IMF had zero concern about that, right? They had so much concern about tax revenue. Oh my God, this is going nowhere. You need tax revenue up to 15% of the GDP.
Yeah.
Then they are the, as Kalpa said, like mid 1990s, they are the guys who came and said, look here, you have to, liberalize the current account of the balance of payments. And through which the BOI was born, and through which the tax concessions was born for the corporates.
Yeah.
That's where even in 2007-8, Professor Mick Moore of the Development Studies Institute in Sussex, he published a pamphlet of about 50-60 pages. There he, highlighted the point, look here, your tax revenue is collapsing since the mid-90s. It was up over 23%, not to say that in mid-90s we were doing brilliantly, that's another issue, but we are focusing on the tax revenue to GDP. That came down collapsing after these reforms, which the IMF was pushing through Chandrika's administration. So that's another thing. But now they're saying, oh my God, but where are they targeting the taxes? They're having a stranglehold on the public through taxation. They're still, are they putting a condition you should immediately or gradually remove the tax concession? No. They've just highlighted the point that tax concessions are an issue. But have they made a condition out of it? Have they made a demanding, binding condition where your program is bound to, the program will cancel unless you do no, they are just to show that they are civilized and on paper they are for people. Now they're with the second review, that's even that those progressive clothing have also been stripped down. That we can.
So, I mean, they released 3 tranches without the government meeting certain requirements.
Right. If you give me 1 minute just to highlight where I started on the 95%. Now, as I said, it's just 50%, right? So what happens when they pin it on 95%? A country like us loses entire credibility in going and demanding a sizable debt cancellation. Because our debt is like, debt to GDP is something like 105% in 2023. So they are saying by you reaching 95%, you are fine, right? You will be accepted. Then you take off the capability of the third world country in the debt negotiation process with the creditors that we need a sizable debt cut. Because they will say, look here, you are fine by 95%, that's what the IMF is saying. So you hardly need a slashing. So that was happened with the bilaterals. They are not giving a haircut, but there is some relief. But it is compared to what other countries have got in the global south and in the west, that is negligible. And to say what is going on with the ISBs is absolutely draconian. Our debt burden, like Kalpa initially said, has increased by roughly 20%. From on ISBs, we were supposed to pay something like 16.9 billion. Now in total, we are supposed to pay 19.6 billion. The only thing is that we are getting 8 more years to pay back. So it's like issuing a new bond with a 10% interest rate of 1.5 billion face value, which is crazy. This
so the restructure is basically like you're changing the terms.
Restructure is actually restructuring on the other. This is good for the creditors. Now they are talking about some Subbaranji and so on. Absolutely, Subba to the maximum. To the creditors, they must be eating kiribat now and lighting crackers. Right? But we are supposed to do it according
just to summarize what Kalpa and Danusha have been saying is that a democratic country, when we go into any agreement or when we go into a debt negotiation, we need to have a plan of our own. We need to have a plan of our own. This is what we are going to ask for. This is what we are going to ask for on behalf of the people, not on behalf of us and our relatives. But what we can understand now is that the people who went into this debt negotiation had no interest or no concern about the people of Sri Lanka. They were trying to protect their interests. We have brought this country to a crisis. Now let's save ourselves and get out of this mess. And that is what I think Kalpa and Danusha have been pointing out. So when we, PSA, when we come into power, what Kalpa said, we need to have our own numbers. Without having our own numbers, we can't really negotiate anything. We don't know our turf, what are we going to negotiate on? So that is the first thing we would do in terms of coming to a analysis on where we are at and what we are going to be demanding, and what we are going to be demanding in terms of the responsibility of the international creditors when they gave this debt. It's not only about us, it's also about them and who they were negotiating with and who they were lending to. That is the part which is, I think, missing the most when it comes to this debt restructuring.
Right. So we know that the debt issue is macro critical for Sri Lanka, right? I mean, but the fact is now we have this mountain of debt. So in the absence of an IMF program, what is the alternative in terms of actual real policy that you will implement in terms of revenue generation, efficiencies in the state sector, all of that, our expenditure, what are the real policies that you will bring in that will address that?
Yeah.
In the and will that be sufficient to sort of appease or please the international markets or whatever to continue, because credit is how an economy grows anyway, right? So we still need that to a certain extent, right? At least in the private sector. So what will replace the current system if you were to come into power?
Sure. I'll mention a couple of things, and
sure.
they will actually add a couple of more. Very first thing we should do is, if I add a couple of things to my very first comment, there should be a proper auditing of...
Sorry, you mentioned this,
yes.
Having our own numbers.
Yes.
Do you not trust the central bank numbers?
We don't.
On the macro side?
We don't trust that. So there should be an international body. There are many progressive agencies all around the world where do these kind of tasks, helping the indebted countries. Let me mention one institution who is one of the very prominent social scientist economists, who was Eric Toussaint, a French, I believe, Belgium economist. He's working for this institution called Committee for Abolitioning Illegitimate Debt. Their shortened abbreviation is CAD team. So we should get the technical and political consultancy from them. These are the people who did the debt restructuring for analysis for, not restructuring, analysis for ICPADO, where they were able to reduce their debt for a considerable, huge out of a huge number. So we should get the technical support from this agency. And also there are...
If I can just interrupt you there. Malati also made this point that we can't trust the numbers, right? Remember, she said there's huge issues with transparency when it comes to declaration of numbers.
Yeah.
A lot of these, especially on the SOE side, they don't even publish.
SOE's annual reports are published, but for instance, the telecom and the insurance, we can actually see the annual reports.
Right.
But in terms of actually the transparency on numbers, we also have a problem with, for instance, corporates. Right. As opposed to the private sector, as opposed to the public sector. For instance, telecom and insurance, if we want to see their annual reports, it's online. Yeah. But in terms of what... I will let you explain about the numbers.
Go ahead. No,
yes, so these institutions are there, and we should get the best support from them. You asked me whether I believe, I trust the central bank numbers. I don't, because if you look at the governing body of the central bank, they are more IMF than IMF itself. If the IMF asks them to jump, they do. Whatever the danger that the country was driving to, they would do that. So we don't trust that. So very first thing we should do is get the international support, because we have a proper reason. We are indebted, poor country, which is in the global south. She correctly mentioned that more than 54 countries actually currently indebted. So there's a proper ground for that. On the ground of debt justice, there's a proper ground. Second thing we should do is building up a cartel of indebted countries, 53 members.
There is a movement already to cancel
yes,
for the global south anyway, isn't there? There's already a...
So on one hand, these kind of movements can actually share the technical understanding. How did they actually deal with the creditors? What kind of conversations were on? And also, it will create a collective bargaining power in the face of in any disagreement, in any conversation, any tabling of any matter. It will create a collective bargaining power. That's a must. So there should be a cartel of debtors. We should definitely enter into that kind of cartel. Third one is actually increasing the fiscal strength of the country. Otherwise, we cannot defeat austerity. There's a myth in economic literature where they say increasing money supply in the system would definitely create inflation. It is a wrong theory. There's no empirical backup. If you look at the numbers of Sri Lanka, if you look at the inflation numbers of inflation in Sri Lanka, our inflation is directly connected, correlated with the import prices, primary commodities of imported prices. So there should be.
You don't believe the money printing led to that, to a certain extent?
Well, marginally. The correlation is actually comes from production cost. Our production cost is directly linked with the imported commodities. That's the link. So there should be a mechanism to fiscal stimulus. If you read, I'm sure you have read the very first IMF recommendation. They have mentioned about social safety nets. Yeah. How much money they have allocated for they have recommended to allocate for social safety nets is 0.5% out of GDP, which is very marginal. We have to treat 7 million poor people in this country. So is it appropriate? Is it sufficient? Absolutely not. So there should be a proper mechanism out of the fiscal stimulus to treat that huge amount of that population of poor people. Let me mention one thing. If you look at any crisis in the Western countries, 1929 Great Depression, 1971 oil shock, 2007-2008 financial crisis, government fiscal deficit played a huge role. Why the hypocrisy? Why isn't it good for Sri Lanka? Why isn't it good for fiscal stimulus are not good for the countries in the global south? We should properly, definitely scientifically ask this question. So the government has a bigger role to play in this kind of crisis situation. So that's the third element of the strategy.
Maybe Dhanusha can.
You want to add to that? I have some follow-ups, but go ahead.
I think the right now, let's say you gain power, what happens day after the revolution, you call it. So the first thing in Biopedia I would do is that we have a huge issue in our the government revenue expenditure. You have to first of all address what is right now immediately within your purview, which is your revenue and expenditure, and especially your expenditure side, right? Revenue also has like secondary effects. You have to wait till your revenue streams realize, but expenditure is right under your control. So what is the largest expenditure portion out of revenue, as I just highlighted like before, is the interest expenditure. We have to grab the snake right from its neck, not from the tail, or we haven't been even tapping it. But so here is the interest payments for the bonds that were issued especially between 2021 to mid 2023, or I should say early 2022 to mid 2023, where our domestic debt like ballooned. And I say the interest payments was 1 trillion rupees in 2021. It had 1-to-1 ratio with the wage bill, or the wages and salary bill. It went through the roof by the end of 2022, and it's still the case. Now we have about 1 trillion in wages and salaries. We are close to 3 trillion, almost 3 trillion in interest payments. Had that been addressed through the domestic debt restructure? Now that was we need a domestic debt restructure. That is the first thing we should do. So that ratio has gone from 1 to 1 to 1 to 3. So we pin down what are these bonds that are eating into the revenue streams, and we bring down the coupon rates, not in a way that the coupon rates will disappear, but to the rates that are already existing in the markets, some around 10 to 12%, from these unimaginable rates like over 30%. So to a rate, so that our interest payments are addressed. So now then one would ask, oh my God, now you are creating havoc in the banking system. There will be no revenue for the banks. This is where the banks are minting money. This through government debt, right? So now to answer to that question is that now the banks are also issuing high interest FDs. Now that is the issue, that if you lose revenue from one hand, they will lose a way to address the expenditure, at least to a certain extent. So that can be very easily addressed. That has been done elsewhere in the world. This is not the first time that research has been done.
The reason that was given was that the public would fear banks would collapse. There would be a bank run and things like that.
Yes.
I mean, I'm sure there's a way of doing it. without quite coming to that particular outcome.
Yeah, absolutely, because you just have to balance the inflows and outflows of cash flows.
Yeah.
So the banks would face a problem to pay the people who own these massive FDs. Now, it's not you and me. There are people who own like FDs for 5-10 years with an interest rate of 25 to 35% issued by the banks during that period. They are the ones who are like, what happens is you pay taxes, VAT and whatnot. That goes in the government's hand. They repay the bondholders. That most of the go into the banking system. The banking system pay to the deposit holders, and mostly not to like the people like having like virtually no savings, but with all the money parked in the banks. So these interest rates should be brought down also to the current market levels. So it has no scope for any bank run as they because
there's no transparency in this anyway. Like we don't know at which rates the domestic bonds have been.
But domestic bonds we know. All the serial numbers are published by the central bank, and all the coupons, all that we know. Bond rates, we know that. It's that the public do not know, but the central bank publishes this monthly analysis report that is only accessible to the bank CEOs. That has all the FD, the average weighted rates. All that is done very clearly. They are more than capable of doing this. They have the expertise 1,000 times more than what is required to do this seamlessly. Right. So that is number one. You bring down so that there is so much the revenue then you have room, you have fiscal room to address the immediate humanitarian crisis that we are facing, which is on one hand there's an economic structural issue. Our production system is collapsing. On one hand, we have a massive humanitarian crisis of growing poverty and hopelessness among the public, especially. So these things, so that is one way. Second thing is even what the IMF itself has sort of addressed nominally without putting a legal demand for it. That is withdrawing all the tax concessions. So tax concession, what is the cost of tax? What is the tax expenditure? We have to see that. So tax expenditure is the amount of taxes that were foregone due to concessions. So from
the opportunity cost.
Yes, 2020 March 31st to 2023 April 1st, the 12 months, the tax concessions during that period alone amounted to 978 billion according to this government, which published a report on tax expenditure on 31st March under the duress of the IMF. So all those conditions did not just magically fall into the IMF's framework, but these were things that are pushed through Aragalaya, right? And people were demanding, look, there are so many, especially about the stolen assets and so on, right? And tax concessions, and that is also in the public debate, right? So all this made through, but then IMF made sure, look, they are not legally binding to implement these things. So the numbers came out. So look at what 900 is, close to 1 trillion. That is the entire wage bill, where the neoliberals.
So I think we can agree that
go on a rant about the wage bill, right? So what about this is almost equal to the entire wage bill.
Agree. I think domestic debt restructure should have been done more thoroughly without just singling out the EPF.
Right.
And I think removing concessions, I think we can all agree on that, right? I mean, those are necessary things to bring some equilibrium to our financial system.
It will bring a massive, more than equilibrium. There will be a tremendous amount of surplus, which you can do virtually anything with. This is almost equal to about 2 to 2.5 trillion annually.
Right.
2 to 2.5 trillion annually is what is that? It's well, our total revenue is expected to be around 4 trillion this year. So that is more than well close to well. Obviously, now let me also reiterate. Now in 2023, this is almost like 2022, right? 970. This is even greater in this year because the currency properly collapsed during this period. So the tax expenditure is much greater now with the concessions. So we are looking at past numbers. So the possibilities are boundless. With these, and of course, just to reiterate what Kalpa said about the foreign debt restructuring, our own, what is this, the institution that audits the Auditor General's Department came out with a report in 2023 saying 67% of our project loans, foreign debt, which amounted to 8.2 trillion in rupees, 67% is missing in terms of assets.
So in terms of like ODS debt, international, I mean, the fact is that we have all of that, right? We are saddled with this debt burden, which actually basically what the IMF deal has done is like put that responsibility down the road. Basically, we are just deferred that responsibility. We kept it alive, maybe pass it down to another generation. But in terms of like your policy, now you're talking about like fiscal discipline, bringing in certain fiscal discipline and all of that. But at the same time, you oppose SOE restructure, right?
We don't oppose
sale of SOEs.
We don't.
Right?
Yeah, we don't oppose. I think we agree that certain SOEs need restructuring.
Right.
And
what would you consider those that are essential, and what would you consider the ones that?
For instance, just look at what's happening now. The SOEs which have been chosen for sale, two of the SOEs, one is Sri Lanka Insurance and Sri Lanka Telecom. Both these SOEs have been generating billions in profit. But those are the SOEs which the government has targeted to privatize. And we are raising the question why. This, for instance, Sri Lanka Insurance, if you go down the highway, there's a big billboard which says we have paid the highest dividends to our shareholders or whatever. So the question which you are raising is, you say that SOEs need to be restructured, but you're selecting SOEs which have been making profits, which have been paying dividends to the Sri Lanka Treasury. So if you're already in a financial crisis, why are you privatizing SOEs which are contributing to the Sri Lankan Treasury, which can be used for various things, for instance, education, health, and so on? So that's the first question. Second question which we're raising is, we are not primarily against...
But just quickly, back to that.
Yeah.
Do you believe in general that the government should be in the business of running businesses?
We are not averse to that idea. We are not averse to that idea. We are not averse. It's not a black and white question. It depends on the situation. If in certain instances, it's for instance, if particularly when a country is in a state of crisis, sometimes it's a good idea. For instance, we were talking about buses the other day, right? Sri Lankan buses, largely it has been privatized. Of course, the state has a certain portion of it and so on. Private buses do not run in rural areas because it's not profit making. The only institution which can cover that gap is the state. Whether it's profit making or whether it's loss making, Sri Lankan government will run buses in rural areas, which is essential for transport. So despite the fact that in balance sheets you would see a loss,
that nobody will disagree. So areas like public transportation, power generation, power distribution, education, various things, right? Health and all of that. I mean, things that we are sort of proud of, right? Our health and education and things like that. That those things under the control of the government, but like running an airline, for example, right? Doesn't that, maintaining them under the control of the government, doesn't that increase your corruption vulnerabilities and risks?
So there are two things, right? As I said, we are not averse to the idea of government running businesses because we, as I've mentioned the few, telecom and insurance, these are businesses, they have run profitably, right? But there is a huge problem of local corruption amongst the system, and the reason for that local corruption is the fact that people have been appointed to use these state-owned enterprises for their own political gains and so on. So in our policies and structures, we have mechanisms which we would be proposing, our proposals is going to come out, where the corruption, the way political patronages and politicians are corrupting these state-owned enterprises, first that would be stopped. Before we can even discuss the idea of whether the state should be running businesses or not, first we have to agree with the fact that how they have corrupted these systems, and it is through this corruption that these state-owned enterprises have fallen into this state of crisis, is something we have to agree on and stop. Thereafter, if there is a particular need where, even after all of that has been stopped, if there is a particular need where a state-owned enterprises is anyway loss-making, the business model is bad or it just doesn't make sense at all, then we don't have to carry on with it. But right now what we are seeing is that there is no diagnostic on why, for instance, as you very correctly mentioned, the Sri Lanka, the electricity board. People have been talking about corruption, but corruption is only part of the problem. The main problem is that the electricity has been subsidized for everyone. Yeah. So if a unit is being produced for a certain number, and then you are selling it for half the price for everyone, then automatically is going to be loss making. So once again we go back to culpas, because we are not the state right now. We can only take numbers which the state is producing. So it is based on these numbers that people like Dhanusha and Kalpa have come up with certain analysis. But when we do become the state, then we have the numbers, we have our own analysis, then we can really look at where the problem lies, and then we can decide what we want to do. But before we can even talk about restructuring, is for sure. There is no second thought of restructuring state-owned enterprises. But before we can even talk about privatization, we need to know where the problem is. And right now, the problem which the government is presenting is in fact not the problem. They are just taking on profit-making state-owned enterprises and wanting to sell it off for a cheap price so that they can continue to make their money.
Right.
So that is where we are at right now.
Yeah, on that point, I mean, right now what we are seeing is almost like a fire sale of assets.
Yeah,
so I think all of that can be solved by getting a properly mandated government in place.
Yes.
So that we know that there's a good faith negotiation going on, or decisions are made in good faith.
But just to answer your question, we are not averse to governments running businesses. We are not averse to that.
Okay.
Because maybe the economists have had to it, because there are other countries like the United States, China, for instance, countries which have developed have had their own businesses.
Yeah, I think yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, last week with Malathi we discussed that at length, where Singapore has what corporation is that? Temasek, and so on. So there are models that we looked at and studied and so on.
So we are not averse to that idea in answering your question.
Right. Okay. So let's move away from this and maybe look at the political ideology, right? Like, so your political ideology is sort of towards the left, rooted in Marxism to a certain extent.
There are Marxists and there are non-Marxists also, but
and
left.
So on.
Yes.
But Marxism talks about controlling means of production and so on. So do you believe that the country is, we see a swing to the left, but do you feel like it has swung that far to the left that they will be receptive to your ideology right now? Because now Peratugami is part of the
yes.
Right now Peratugami is seen to a certain extent as an impediment to progress, right, with the strikes and so on. So how are you going to convince people that they need to move to where you are ideologically, because that's what you need to do to eventually win an election, right?
We are part of the alliance, so I'm going to say something about one of the reasons why all of us are in this alliance with Peratugami is I want to speak about a specific issue. Right now there is a huge issue going on about plantation wages and the fact that workers are not being paid proper wages and so on. I believe it was in 2017, there was a campaign going on where workers were demanding for 1,000 rupees per day, right? And when the initial demand came on, no political party was not even the political parties which were representing the plantation workers were willing to take on that struggle. And it was Peratugami, Frontline Socialist Party, which took on that struggle, gave leadership to that struggle. Of course, it was a movement, so there were many people involved, but they really gave a political kind of leadership to that movement. And that is when I realized that yes, there are many ideas or biases about parties like the Frontline Socialist Party. Many reasons for that. One is they have never been in power, state power. And the second is they have never really, I would argue, they have never really seriously contested for power. Of course, they stand for elections and so on, but they have never really seriously contested for power. So when a political party such as that takes on a legitimate demand of workers and makes it a political issue, despite all kinds of criticism which were being thrown at them, I think that shows political integrity. And similarly, during the Aragalaya, they were one of the first political parties to say we stand with the people. I mean, NPP was going back and forth. No one knew where Sajaba was standing at the start. But Peratugami, Frontline Socialist Party came and said, no, we stand with the people. I mean, we are not going to be present there because people don't want any political parties, but we stand with the people. So I think it's moments like that, political integrity is what the word which I'm looking for. It's like moments like that when you really realize where a political party stands. I think it is because of these moments, in crisis moment, where does a political party stand? It is in these moments that you realize where a political party, even when it comes to power, where it can take us. So it is in that belief that we have come together with Frontline. So I don't agree with the notion that they are against progress. They have taken political positions which are not popular in the mainstream, but the people whom they have stood for, workers, fishers, plantation workers, they know what a party like Frontline can do to a political campaign. So since Peratugami is not here, I'm just mentioning as to why we are working in an alliance with the Frontline Socialist Party. But in terms of left ideas and so on, I don't think there is a swing to the left. And the reason for that, and maybe you all also can comment on, and this is my personal opinion, I think the reason for that is the NPP is being put forward as a left political alliance when it is actually proposing right-wing solutions to problems, or rather status quo solutions to problems. And in fact, I think the NPP as a party has moved far into the right. It's no longer, I don't call it a left alliance anymore. So because NPP is considered this a left alliance, but they are proposing right-wing policies for solutions, I don't think the country is in a swing to the left. Despite that, when we look at the ground, when we look at the things which people are demanding for living wages, for livelihoods, for jobs and so on, these are things which come with ideas of redistribution. People are not demanding for billionaires, they are demanding for redistribution of wealth. So these are ideas which come with socialism and socialist principles. So I think on the ground, the demands which are coming are socialist ideas and socialist principles, but the leadership which has emerged or which has been emerging in the past, unfortunately have forged ties with people who have brought this country to a state of crisis, and I don't think they are in a state to take the demands of the people and bring it to power. I think that is one of the reasons we formed this alliance also.
Right. So
maybe we can,
You want to add to that, or we can move, because there are some questions we want to get to.
Sure. Yeah.
So the key parts of your manifesto don't include sort of good governance, or 6E. Because these were the demands of the Aragalaya, right? Good governance, system change, accountability for past crimes, law and order, equal justice, and things like that. Where do they rank in the order of sort of importance in your party platform or manifesto?
System change is key, but we don't think system change can be done by tampering with the existing system. I think what the Aragalaya was demanding was an overhaul of the system. And the moment people say overhaul, there are various things. Oh my God, people are going to go into violence and so on. It's not going into violence. It's a radical rethinking of what we have proposed as our economic and social structures in the last 40 years and what that has done to people. So that is the radical rethinking of the system which Kalpa and Dhanusha had spoken about in terms of the economy. And I think everything ultimately is tied to a great extent to the economy. Of course, with that the social and political structures also come into being. So very much central part of our party's plan is system change, but of course we have named it differently. We have come up with the 5E plan and so on. Yeah. But system change and the overhaul of the current system, which has led our country to a state of crisis, is one of the central themes of our alliance's political manifesto.
Right. If I add something to it,
sure.
Swastika said, well, people can interpret system change in many ways.
Yeah.
I have given a talk in BOI for one of the investors. The system change was actually the efficiency of delivering his commodities to the port, because he is an exporter. So it can be interpreted in many ways, but in our deep understanding, there's no system change without changing capitalism. So there should be moving towards, there should be a change towards change towards changing the capitalist mode of production.
Does that mean, so again, we are sort of reverting back to certain sort of Marxist ideology, right? Like Absolutely. About controlling means of production, right? That is the key tenet of the economic sort of philosophy of that particular ideology. Yeah. How do you reconcile that and the system of free markets that, Sri Lanka is now well entrenched in the free market system, right? So how do you reconcile the difference? I mean, now we need investment, we need to grow our economy, which means we absolutely need investment. Would investors feel free to come to a country where, where that type of ideology has taken root? Because if you look at sort of globally, where has this ideology taken root successfully?
That's a good question. Well, I don't have too many examples to show you that this is where it has been successful. But definitely, the free market ideology and the ownership of the means of production by the workers, by the primary producers, cannot be reconciled. So there should be a path forward. There should be a political risk that has to be taken. But let me give you an example. If you think about this is a very isolated, it can be an abstract example. If you think about the rice market of Sri Lanka, who's controlling the rice market of Sri Lanka? Only 4 people control. Only 4 companies are controlling the rice market. But
that's elite capture of that's because it's been captured by a few.
Captured by few out of political power, and
right.
Absolutely, capital and political power goes hand in hand.
Yeah.
They have their own class interest. If you look at that market, who's producing for these 3-4 big monopolies, or let's say oligopolies? Farmers, basically, primary producers. So in one of the things, I mean, within this mode of production, one of the things we can do is actually giving the right to produce and to exchange and to increase the value, maybe thriving in the value chain with higher added value in the rice market, giving that to the farmers. So there are things that you can do within a transformation program, within a transition program, within capitalism.
So you're saying to liberalize?
Not to liberalize.
Right.
Well, it can be liberating.
If you're giving the option to the farmers, you're liberalizing.
It can be liberating for the farmers, not liberalizing in a bourgeois sense. It is absolutely giving the right to the farmers to control their means of production, control their surplus, and to control their exchanges.
What would you do with the subsidies? Because paddy farmers especially, right? We heard about this yesterday at a seminar we were at. Paddy farmers are highly subsidized, right? So what would you do to the subsidies? Would you continue to subsidize the fertilizer and the water and the grain for?
Once again, a good question. If you think about the change mode of production within the agriculture sector, we have to change that input mechanism as well. Fertilizer, irrigation, land distribution. We have to rethink these things. Otherwise, if we depend on the chemical fertilizer that we are using, which are environmentally harmful, and we know that I have done research work in one of the areas in Sri Lanka, Rajangalaya, peasant resettlement scheme. If you go and see properly, the soil is actually now poisonous. The water sources has polluted completely. So there should be a mechanism within the mechanism of giving the right to the farmers. There should be re-implementation of environmentally friendly inputs and other things.
Just to answer this question on subsidies, the question of subsidies arises because farmers are not given a guaranteed price. So even with all of the subsidies, today rice farmers are loss-making. But there was a time in Sri Lanka where farmers were guaranteed a price by the state. And guaranteeing a price by the state for something like rice, which all of us, this is our staple food, relying on, I don't think it's a bad state policy, because that would ensure that all of us eat all of us can afford rice, which today many people can't. So I think instances like this, and that is why this idea of free market is never free. When you ask the question, so it has ended up with 4 people. How did that happen? It happened in a free market context, right? So even in the most advanced economies, you realize that yes, technically it is free market, but market is not free, because when the so-called free market goes into a financial crisis, like what happened in 2008, who comes to bail out? The state comes to bail out the banks on taxpayers' money. So when the free market system goes into a country, suddenly everyone is looking, state should bail out and so on, and then the people's money is taken, and then people who brought the country to a state of crisis is bailed out, just like what is happening in Sri Lanka as well, right? So even this idea of free market has been contested. So much literature has been written on it. So so that's one thing which I want to say about. The other thing about Marxism is that Marxism, one of the things which people don't usually, I'm not a Marxist, I'm reading Marxism after speaking to this, and I think there are many things which you can learn from it. One of the things we learn from Marxist analysis of ideas is that it's always connected to history and moments. You can't remove a Marxist principle from what's happening in Sri Lanka. So simply because Marx said something in this year, you can't just transport the idea and say, oh my God, this principle has failed. That is against the idea, understanding of Marxist theory. So I think I'm not a Marxist, I'm not an expert, but just to say the issue, the policies which we have put forward is really looking into what exists right now. Debt issue exists right now, the issue of revenue, the issue of taxation, the issue of the national question, all of it are present issues. And that is what we are trying to tackle in terms of the resources and the ideas we have. Just to put it into context.
Okay, so we'll move forward. Sure. Otherwise, there's a bunch more questions that we need to get to. I feel like it's important to debate these things, right? Because that's how we gain an understanding, but we have like constrained by time. So the next question was, is there a connection between you and the Perudugami? That's a yes. I think we've already answered that.
Yes.
Will you be standing for the presidential election? There will be somebody for that. If so, like, what is your expectation in terms of like, have you done your numbers in terms of where you stand with the public right now?
So we were.
Who's your nominee? Do you have a nominee? Are you going to?
We have not.
Swastika.
We have not decided as a we have not decided as an alliance to come forward with the.
But you will contest.
Yes, we are contesting. Yeah. And in terms of the numbers, what we are actually focusing on, the Frontline Socialist Party and the new Democratic Marxist-Leninist Party have stood for elections in the past, so they have their numbers. But as an alliance, this is the first time we are contesting. So we can come up with a ballpark figure. This is what we're expecting, and so on. But we are not going to assess this alliance and the strength of this alliance and where it's going to move forward in terms of exact ballpark figures.
The thing is, though, you're going to be breaking votes from the left. Do you think you will inadvertently help the incumbent sort of parties by contesting, by breaking votes from the left?
So that's that's the other question which is always asked from us. Yeah. When people mean the left, they mean the NPP. We don't think the NPP is left. Yeah. So if someone is convinced by left policies and idea, they won't be voting for NPP. Yes. So by forming this alliance,
have you met our electorate? right. So I mean,
electorate,
it's popular support. I mean, people tend to go with momentum, right? So I mean, there's a certain amount of momentum towards NPP. Yeah. They are perceived as the left.
One of the connected to that question, we cleared this in the start, but just to emphasize, one of the reasons why we wanted to come into this election game, because we felt that certain ideas, for instance, the position on IMF was not being taken forward by status quo parties, because they feel that if they come to power, they can't have an alternative plan and policy. Right. But we don't believe that. Okay. So by proposing, people who are already convinced by the status quo would anyway not vote for us. Yeah. But people who are not convinced by the status quo, like many of us to join this alliance, they would be looking into this political party and what we are saying and so on. So I think that is where our responsibility lies in clarifying our positions.
I mean look, in the context of a general election, I mean, we have one person who nationally got 30,000 votes sitting now as president, right? So in the context of a general election, I mean, if you get a certain percentage of national votes, there is a possibility that you could actually get people into parliament, which is when you'll have privilege, you can speak up. I mean, would that be the strategy? I mean, then...
One of the things in terms of elections and in terms of getting into parliament is one of the things which we are very clear on, is that any candidate who gets into parliament, whether through electoral votes or through national list, will always be connected to a movement. Yeah. That is what Sri Lanka has never had. You elect a person, you put that person into parliament, and then that person does whatever he wants, jumps around. But the nominees which we are putting into parliament will always be connected to movement. So in our policies we have this recalling right, but whether we have the recalling right or not in existence when certain candidates go into parliament, as an alliance we are going to implement that recalling right, that if a person violates ideas and principles of the alliance, we would be recalling that candidate and we would be putting up another person. So that is something which we want to specifically state. The other thing...
Would that be legally binding?
For our alliance, yes. Because it's on our alliance.
It's the internal policy, right?
Yeah, but they decide to down with legal bindings or not.
Not really. I mean, they can do it, right?
Yeah, they can still do it.
Yeah,
but that person would be completely disconnected to the alliance thereafter, and that is something which we feel very, very strongly on.
Yeah, so you'll have
and the alliance would break if that's not
people with integrity who will actually stick to your policies, right? So another question: your group consists of individuals who played a key role in the Aragalaya, many of whom were persecuted immediately after the president took over. How do you plan to fight and regain the narrative that the Aragalaya was a people's movement and one that stands up for them? Right? I think we see how people are maligned, especially you, right, Chris? Right? Anytime like you make a statement, you're accused of various things. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, one of the things I want to at least the post-election scenario is going to be very interesting in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
We don't know the real outcomes, exact outcomes, but that's going to be very interesting. So the alliance will definitely, it is under discussion, we are discussing it thoroughly. It is going to play a key role of giving leadership to the upcoming struggles.
Right.
We have seen that even the so-called leaders of the left has condemned the strikes. People are demanding to increase their real wages, but the so-called leaders are condemning those strikes. So they will need a very systematic, very organized body to fight for them. So definitely we are going to appear for them. We are going to continue the fight with the people.
During the Aragalaya, all of us in the alliance, without an exception, the Frontline, the NDMLP, the Socialist People's Forum, the three political parties stood with the Aragalaya and stood with the people's uprising. It was not perfect. All of us know that, right? It was not perfect. But still, when 1 million people come to Colombo and push for change, irrespective of the political spectrum, we should have stood with the people. Should have stood with the Aragalaya. So whatever criticism which is coming around, we don't really care. We stand strongly with the Aragalaya. All of us were actively in the Aragalaya, and we defend it. I mean, we would continue to defend it.
Yeah. Another question is: do you see synergy with like your new political movement? And you see the Centenary Front has come up as a new political movement. Do you all see synergies in terms of how you can approach elections together, or you will do everything on your own?
I think the Centenary movement, one of our main concerns with the Centenary movement is that we are not very clear on their economic policy. I mean, we don't believe that an economic policy can be here and there. You need to be very clear on what you stand for. We are very clear on what we stand for. Yeah. The UNP is very clear on what it stands for and so on. Yeah. So I think the Centenary movement has been quite vague in terms of their economic policy, and because of that, we don't see any synergy between our groups.
You guys. Yes. Okay, so you differ on that front. I think this next question was answered already, right? Your alliance recently met with the Northeast Coordination Committee, which advocates for a federal structure as a solution for the ethnic and minority issues. What is your stance on this? I think
we have not met with the Northeast Coordination Committee.
You haven't?
No, we have not. But in terms of the federal structure, we are not. What we are proposing is not federalism.
Not federalism.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's okay. You have members from all communities in your group. One of the key aspects of the Aragalaya was one country, one people. But politicians kept playing divisive politics to win elections. How important is secularity and equality in your group? How do you plan to change this to ensure it's eliminated? So this is the last question.
Yes, secularity is one of the essence of our group. We strongly believe that no religion or no ethnicity should be majoritarian or should have power to decide over other ethnicities and other religions and so on. So a secular state is central theme, one of the central themes of our alliance. But just going into that issue also, when the reason why we have termed it as the national question as opposed to all races should hold hands and live happily ever after is that we can't hold hand and live happily ever after because of what has happened in the past. Yeah. So there has to be some kind of accountability. There has to be justice. There has to be accountability for what happened in the war. There has to be accountability for what happened with race riots. What happened soon after the Easter Sunday, how Muslims were blamed for it. The entire community was blamed for it. So our proposal in terms of racial equality, religious equality comes from a place of reckoning with the past, comes from a place of accountability and justice. So I think that is where we differ from maybe certain other status quo parties which does not even want to talk about accountability. Ours starts from the point of accountability where we recognize what has happened in the past, we speak about justice, but we also move forward in terms of policies and principles.
Yeah, I think there's a thirst from the people for accountability. I think people want to see somebody sort of held responsible for everything from the economic crisis going backwards. We've been talking about the Easter Sunday attacks, justice for the victims. We're talking about like journalists. Chris has a list that he reads out. We have exhaustive list of scams, murders, various things. So I think that is certainly something that we can all get on board with. So before we wind up, right? We've taken like quite a bit of your time. It's almost 9 o'clock. So before we wind up, Disha usually has a couple of quotes that we'd like to read out. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for spending time with us. Thank you for explaining your sort of political philosophy or economic sort of plans and ideas. And
two things. Thank you for having us. And the other thing is congratulations for having this for 265 days.
95.
Sorry, 295 days. Yeah. It's an unbelievable achievement to keep the spirit of the Aragalaya alive, to keep such a gathering alive. I just wanted to congratulate you on that and wish you luck for
Thank you on behalf of the group. And actually, we're a group that was inspired by the Aragalaya.
Yes.
Really,
yes.
We may not even have known each other.
Yes.
And now we're like big family. We're a big family now.
Yes.
Yeah.
So congratulations on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Likewise.
No, and also we have always said we need new political movements. We need new sort of younger people coming into the political process, because we are dealing with the same old guys for the last so many years, right? Prashant had that little press conference where he was saying the ages and all of that. So I mean, congratulations for putting this together, and we wish you all the very best.
Thank you.
Nisha, you wanna?
Yeah. So I just have two. Dissent is what rescues democracy from a quiet death behind closed doors. That's my first one.
Yeah.
Second one is rejecting the notion that democracy and markets are the same. Young people are calling for an end to the poverty, grotesque levels of economic inequality, the suppression of dissent, and the permanent war state.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the war here ended when, and look at our defense expenditure, right? I mean,
which is increasing every day.
Right. Exactly. I
don't
don't think we can have.
People, really.
Yeah, I don't think we can make a serious attempt at fiscal discipline without addressing the fact that we're spending so much on a
I think education
defense
held together is pretty much what is going to be.
That's right. 48% of state salaries is actually going to the forces.
But may I ask
Can I ask one last question? I know you were a trade unionist as well.
Yes.
What will you do with the bloated public sector? I mean, you have some places where it's understaffed, I mean, like lecturers and teachers and then you have this public sector where political appointments and whatever they promise jobs and they've stuffed it. How will you deal with that? Because that is actually bleeding the country's...
And also, most of them have unionized, and unions are seen as an impediment to progress, right? So, yeah.
So, two questions. In terms of the bloated public sector, there are certain numbers which are saying some one public sector for this amount of people and so on. I think that number is misleading, because actually your question has the answer. There are some sectors which are completely understaffed. Primary school teachers, the hospital staff, lecturers are heavily overworked and so on. Bloated public sector, there are certain political appointments which are being made. That is part of the accountability process, where we have to question those appointments and why those appointments have been made and whether those appointments actually benefiting the public or not.
And if it's not?
If it's not benefiting the public, then we have to see a way of, these are also workers, so we can't just throw them out overnight, but there will be a way of phasing them out. But at the same time, there are sectors which need officers and so on. So I won't exactly use the word bloated, because when we move certain officers out, there might be other departments and institutions which need manpower. which we are going to...
Not. I mean, some of but my thing is that the people who have been put in may not be qualified to actually do the jobs.
So we have to. So one of the central themes of the proposals which we are putting forward is accountability, and accountability is also about what has happened to our public sector. And why does the public sector, which is supposed to serve the public, have such a negative attitude from the lowest ranking from the lowest economic tiers to the higher economic tiers, right? So that is something which we will look at in terms of policy. Corruption is also to eradicate. Public corruption is one of it, but we are also looking at corporate corruption also. So corruption we are looking at it in a holistic way in terms of how to eradicate corruption and how certain institutions and structures and tiers of society are funding this corruption. That also we would be looking into. So that is in terms of the state sector. In terms of unions, what is seen as I think it was the Indian Supreme Court which says trade unions becomes an essential element or part of democracy. So when we speak of trade unions, immediately people imagine or the first thing which comes to our mind is certain privileged trade unions, I would say, who are going into activities which is later used, I won't say which gives a bad, which is later used to discredit the entire trade union movement.
Yes.
But there are moments, like for instance the recent strike action which went on, which one of the things which does not get discussed in the media is that before trade unions, like for instance the teachers union, before they go into a strike action, there is a protracted discussion which goes on with ministers and so on. Give decent wage for teachers. Teachers are overwhelmingly, one of the things is teachers are overwhelmingly women. And that is one of the reasons also the pay gap also becomes gendered. So we know this because we are in the trade union scene, right? So after protracted...
Is there a gender discrimination between what male teachers and female teachers get?
No. So how the gendered nature of wage happens is, for instance, teachers have low pay because majority of the teachers are women. Many of the women go into teaching job. So because of that, they keep wages at a depressed level. Same with the garment sector. Majority of the garment sector workers are women and the wages are depressed. So there is a gendered way in which wages are kept depressed for certain groups of professions as opposed to certain others. So trade unions also, there are certain rogue trade unions, right? Yeah. But what I would request for everyone to think about, because we are also reaching out to an audience which is English speaking, is that do not assess the trade union movement by certain rogue strikes or certain bad actions taken by trade union. Assess the trade union movement by what the trade union movement has done in terms of free education, health, keeping the public sector alive in certain instances and so on.
The power of collective bargaining.
Bargaining, but also assess where the power of collective bargaining is at in terms of the private sector, where workers are dismissed on a regular basis for trying to form unions, particularly in the free trade zones and so on. So the narrative that trade unions are somehow impeding progress, in effect, thereafter it starts affecting workers who are trying to unionize.
Right. I think the politicization of trade unions is probably the issue rather than the trade unions themselves, right? I mean, I think because when you have political trade unions, they are working towards a political goal rather than the goal of the members.
If I may just add just one more sentence there, is that the reason why it becomes a problem that trade unions are connected to political parties is I was thinking about it today morning, right, in terms of the strike action. Most of the political parties, whether it be UNP, SLPP and so on, they're not really looking into the welfare of the workers. They're not looking into the labor laws, they're not looking into wages and so on. They are looking into certain elite interests, and we saw that with the EPF issue, right? So when parties like that form trade unions and trade unions join parties like that or associated with parties like that, automatically the interests of the workers don't get represented. So there is a contradiction in party policies which is completely against workers, and you have this massive trade union attached to this political party. So trade unions can never achieve what it has to achieve if they are stuck with political parties like the SLPP, the UNP and so on. So I think that is where the contradiction comes. In terms of when people say politicization of trade union, what they mean is, why are you standing with political parties which are completely against the interest of workers? I think that is where I want to leave it at.
Okay, so shall we leave it at that? Thank you guys. Thank you so much. Thanks for taking our questions, explaining your various policies and so on. One last slide, we saw this yesterday. People should not be afraid of the government. It should be the other way around. The government should be afraid of the people.
Yes, yes.
And right now, everything's been done to keep people sort of down and not able to express themselves and so on. So again, congratulations. So, for coming forward, and all the very best from us, from GGY. So let's wrap it up, guys. Thank you. That's it for day 295 from GGY. You guys will be back at the StreetCon on Sunday. And thank you, guys. Thank you, CK. And that's a wrap from here. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.